blessing to be here and to share with you our Bible. I've been really enjoying this study. It's an unusual study now, and it's really, I think, when I started it last year, I didn't think about that this study would probably run us right into the season we call Easter Resurrection.
All right.
And it's timely because it's taking us through, and it's going to run us right into the resurrection. And as we're just looking at the last week of Jesus' life, we call it his week of passion. We began, and it's good for the sake of being able to understand how your Bible really fits together. Many times we read our scriptures and we read the Bible, and we read it at just, read it like a book, but we don't know how it all fits together.
Yes.
What happened on what day or what happened on what time. So as we are going through this last week of Jesus' life, we are discovering what happens on Saturday, what happened on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. And just kind of get an overview, we looked at what happened on Saturday he was anointed by Mary. And you remember, John tells us that, John chapter 12, I believe it tells us that he was anointed and for the burial in advance. And then on Sunday, we call it the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He came right into Jerusalem on Sunday. The Bible tells us when he arrives at Jerusalem, there are crowds of people there, and they are hollering Hosanna, and they're crying out, and they're saying, "Save us now, save us now." And they made such a commotion to the religious leaders in Jerusalem, saying, "Well, who is this?" And they said, "It's Jesus of Nazareth." And they were assuming the Jewish people that he was coming to take over and deliver them from the Roman dictatorship and domineering, which he did not do. He goes into the temple. He just looks around, and he goes back to Bethany, which is about 20-mile journey from Jerusalem back to Bethany. On Monday, he returns. He gets up, and Monday he goes back to Jerusalem, and that's when we have the cleansing of the temple. We all know he cleansed it. In fact, we discovered in our lesson that he cleansed the temple twice. He cleansed it at the beginning of his ministry, and he cleansed it at the end of his ministry. You find the first time in the Gospel of John. So he cleansed the temple twice. But on Monday, he cleanses the temple. And he overturned money changers, and he said, "My house should be called a house of prayer, but you made it a den of thieves." And he leaves there and goes back to Bethany. On Tuesday, when he arrives back at Jerusalem, the first question they want to know is, who gave you the authority to do this? And they go into all of this, Jesus going into this, the question and answer. And the whole day from Tuesday of the Passion Week, he's dealing with questions and answers, and they're trying to trap him, and that they may accuse him. And every trap they set for him on Wednesday, on that Tuesday, he is able to get right by him. They bring a coin and say, "Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar?" All this happened on that Tuesday. He goes back to Jerusalem on Tuesday night, and on Wednesday, he does not go anywhere. He stays in Bethany. But remember, we've been discussing that in Bethany, there were 3 meetings that took place on Wednesday. The first meeting that took place on Wednesday was him and his disciples. He tells them, he informs them that he's going to go to Jerusalem, and he's going to be betrayed, and he's going to be crucified. And he brings the guys together. But at some time in Bethany, Judas sneaks off. While in Jerusalem, while he's saying one thing, the religious leaders are meeting, attempting to try to decide how we're going to get rid of him. We got to kill him, and we got to kill him now. We got to get rid of him. They have this meeting, and everything is dispersed, but guess the third meeting, Judas shows up. Judas said, "Okay." And they didn't seek Judas. Judas sought them.
Yes.
He said, "Well, what would you give me for him?" And they bargained for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. He never leaves Bethany on Wednesday. Judas sneaks away to go to Jerusalem. Now we finally come to Thursday. Our lesson begins with Thursday. Open your Bibles, if you have your Bibles, to Luke chapter 14, verses 12 to verses 16. And we're going to talk about what happened on, Mark. What I say, Luke? Mark chapter 14, verses 12 to verses 16.
Amen.
Hey, read together.
Yes, sir.
Let me read it for you. The first day of the unleavened bread, and the first day of the unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare that thou mayest eat the Passover? And he sendeth forth two of his disciples and said unto them, Go ye into the city, and there shall you meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wheresoever he shall go in, say to the good man of the house, the master said, Where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. And his disciples went forth and came into the city and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. So now we get Thursday morning. Thursday morning, they approach Jesus and want to know, where are we going to have the Passover? The Passover is also called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, according to Exodus chapter 23, verse 15, and Deuteronomy 16:16. The reason it is called unleavened bread was because during the Passover season, that 7 days, immediately following the Passover, unleavened bread, a bread without leaven, was to be eaten. Unleavened bread represents the fact that the people had no time to put leaven in their bread before they made haste to depart from Egypt. So the Passover is also known as the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. On Thursday night in the Passover celebration is the Passover celebration for all Jews. The Passover is celebrated on Friday from sunset to sunset. For 1,500 years, since the Exodus, the Passover has been celebrated at the time of the year by the Jews without break. They've been doing this Passover for 1,500 years. They have not missed having the Passover. And this Passover, the Lord they need to celebrate with him, because this will become his final Passover. And he will celebrate it because it is his desire to fulfill all righteousness. This is how it goes. On Monday of the Passion Week, the sacrifices were chosen. They chose lambs. They brought the lambs to the city to be inspected by the priest. And let me say this as well. Because the priests and religious leaders had tables set up, when you brought your lamb on that Monday, they could decline it and say, well, your lamb is not accepted, and so they offer you one of the ones they have there. Well, it cost them maybe a little more because they made money on their sacrifice. So the lamb was chosen on Monday. The lamb would be killed on Thursday. They would be killed by the priest and eaten that night by those who brought the lamb. The preparation. It says, verse 12, the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, the disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare that thou mayest eat the Passover? So, in Bethany, and now they're saying, so, wait a minute, he has not been saying anything about the Passover, and it's fastly approaching. So they approached Jesus and asked him the question, where are we going to eat the Passover? But let me help you out. Jesus never operates without a plan. He never leaves things to the last moment. At some point in time, everything was already in motion for them to have a place to eat the Passover. So he had a plan. He was waiting on them to ask him for it. And that's a good point because we have not, because we ask not. He already has the plan. So all you got to do is just ask. And they asked. He was waiting on them. He'd already arranged the place. Jerusalem is crowded. They need a private room where the 12 of them plus Jesus, and there were many more, could go and eat the Passover, celebrate the Passover. So here's what happens. Jesus sent them into Jerusalem with instructions. They asked him on the second page, where are we going? Where can we go to eat the Passover? The Jerusalem is crowded. If he would have waited to the last moment, he probably had nowhere to eat the Passover. Because it's been believed over 500,000 people or more is there in Jerusalem, in that city for the Passover. Verse 13. He sent 2 of his disciples and said unto them, go ye into the city, and there you shall meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. Now, they had no idea where the Passover place was going to be. They had absolutely no idea. They would not know even how to find it. Jesus is in Bethany, but he knows the instructions to give them in order for them to find a place to set it up. And so he said to them, I'm going to give you the instructions how to find where we're going to eat the Passover. So he says, this will not be difficult for you to find it. You're going to find a man carrying a jar of water, and which is an unusual event because during the biblical time, men didn't carry water. They did not carry, a man did not carry water upon his shoulder. They didn't do that. That was what the women did. He says, you're going to know how to find him because you're going to see something that's unusual. You're going to see a man, hallelujah somebody, carrying a jar of water doing something that women usually do. And then he says, when you find him, follow him, he's going to lead you to the place. Now can you put yourself in the position? They are entering Jerusalem, and they start walking. There's a man with a pitcher of water on his shoulder. They say nothing to him. And they began to follow him. And he leads them to the place. And where the Passover is going to be eaten. Now, this happened for more than one reason. Now, Jesus could have said, and it's like suspected that it probably was John Mark's father. But we don't know that, but it's believed that it was John Mark. In fact, I won't get into that, but it's believed it was John Mark. So he could have said, and they knew John Mark. He could have said, well, go to John Mark's house. And when you find John Mark, everything is already there for you to have the Passover. But he didn't say that. He says to them, now you got to picture what's happening here. All of the disciples are together. And they'll come to him and says, and can I add this also? Judas is with them. They show up, wanted to know, where are we going to go? What place are we going to eat the Passover? And I can hear Judas just waiting for the answer. Because he already made some deals on Wednesday. He's waiting for an opportune time to betray him. So if Jesus would have said, better tell me that our Lord is really smart. You can't trick him. he's always a step or two ahead of you, us. And I can almost see Judas sitting there waiting on the answer to that. And Jesus said, well, no, this is how you're going to find a place. You're going to find a man carrying a pitcher of water, follow him, he's going to lead you to the place. Because if he would have told him the place in advance, Judas would have reported to the religious leaders, and every single day would have been exposed. And they would have caught him there. If he would have told, now, we know he knew. He knew it. He knew exactly where the place is, but he would not reveal it. In order for him to get there, he had to follow his instructions. That means Judas didn't have anything in advance. He left nothing unturned. He covered every detail because Judas is there, hypocritic, acting like he's one of the 12. But he's waiting for an opportunity. Remember, he left that saying, I'm waiting at an opportune time. I'm going to give them to you for 30 pieces of silver. He could have very well said, hey, picked up his cell phone and said, hey, listen, they're going to be at John Mark. But he didn't know, and they didn't know. Verse 14. And wheresoever he shall go in, say to the good man of the house. They don't say anything that he goes in. The master said, where's the guest chamber where I should eat the Passover with my disciples? The Jewish house had rooms that were called the upper rooms. Such houses would look exactly like a small box placed on the top of a small box placed on the top of a larger box. So if you can imagine a box, and then you put another box, a smaller box on top of it. That's how it was situated. And the small box on top of the large box was called the upper room. It was there, and the only way you could get into the upper room, you had to go up the side stairs, making it unnecessary to go through the main room of the house. The upper room had many uses. It was a storeroom. It was a place for quiet and meditation. It was also a guest room for visitors. So he tells them to follow the man and say, the master has need of your guest chamber. Verse 15. And he will show you a large room furnished and prepared. They'll make ready for us. Now here's what's happening. They follow perhaps John Mark's father to his home. When they get there, they are to tell him what the master said. He's going to show you a room that's already furnished. The tables, the chairs, everything is in place. It's already furnished. And the disciples went forth and came into the city and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. Just as he had spoken, that's exactly what they found. Everything in place. There Jesus' disciples out to make ready the Passover. The two disciples are Peter and John. They are sent to prepare the Passover according to Luke chapter 22, verse 8. They tell us who the two disciples are. They're Peter and John. So now, in verse 16, it says, and they made ready the Passover. Only 4 or 5 words, but these 4 words or 5 words mean, and they made ready the Passover. 5 words. A lot of stuff had to happen to make ready for the Passover. So what we're going to do now is tell you what they had to do to get things ready. So what are the preparations that the Jews make for the Passover? The first Passover, when they get there, now this is what these men had to do. The first thing they had to do was a ceremonial searching for leaven. I remember in seminary, one of our class, I went to seminary back in the 80s, late 80s, so you know I don't remember all of that. But I do remember that I don't remember what class it was, but I do remember one of our professors had a Jewish person to come, a Christian Jew, to come in and explain to us what happens on the Passover. We evidently were studying it during that time. And what he said was, and he agreed with this, one of the first things they had to do was to find leaven. He said what would happen was mom would place a little leaven sprinkle of leaven in one of the cabinets, and they had to search and they had to find that leaven because all leaven had to be taken away from the house. So the first thing that the disciples do when they get to the upper room is that they had to do what was called a ceremonial search for leaven. Before the Passover, every particle of leaven must be banished from the house. The bread had to be unleavened without leaven. And we know what leaven is, right? We call it what? Yeast. The purpose of the leaven, the reason they were not to have leaven, as I said earlier, was that when they left Egypt, they didn't have time for bread to rise. They had to get out in a hurry. And so they had to make bread without leaven. The day before the Passover, the master of the house took a lighted candle and ceremonially searched the house for leaven. Before the search, he prayed this prayer. Blessed art thou, Jehovah, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by thy commandments and commanded us to remove leaven. Before the search began, this is what he would pray. And if it was anything like the modern Jews do, that was told me, a little leaven was planted, which meant they had to search through the house until they found it and removed it. And once the search is over, the householder said, all the leaven that is in my possession, that which I have seen and that which I have not seen, be it null, be it accounted as dust of the earth. Leaven had to be removed. Leaven in the New Testament has even a significance with us. When I was writing this, I remembered a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 to verses 8. Listen what it says. Your glorifying is not good. No, you're not. And what's happening here in this particular text, there was a young man in the church at Corinth was going with his I say his stepmother. And the people were allowing it to happen. They were, they were kind of gloating over it. And Paul says, wait a minute. What you're glorifying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? What he's saying, this kind of lifestyle, this kind of influence has a tendency to spread out to the whole church. Listen what he says. Purge out the old leaven, that it may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For Christ is our Passover, is sanctified for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with leaven of malice and wickedness, but the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. He takes leaven and he associated it with malice and wickedness. So he's saying, you got to get that stuff out of you. Because allowing that kind of leaven, it would eventually, just like yeast will, it will cause the whole dough to be affected. So you got to get rid of it. So leaven, not only, it represents unrighteousness and sin. There are some stuff that you just can't put up with. That's what he's saying. You got to get it out of there. In the New Testament, leaven is a symbol of evil influence. If allowed to remain, can corrupt the body of believers. Someone just teaching a false doctrine and you put up with it in the church. You don't correct it. It can spread and affect the whole body. Jesus warned his disciples against the leaven of the Pharisees, their teaching and their hypocrisy. Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 to verses 12. Paul urged the Corinthians to remove that wickedness from the midst of fresh dough, unleavened loaves of sincerity and truth. He says you got to get all of that leaven, wickedness, and malice out. So the first thing those two disciples had to do was make sure there was no leaven in the upper room. The second thing they had to do, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. On Thursday at 3 o'clock, the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. So at some point, they got a lamb. And they are to take this lamb now to the temple. Between the worshipers and the altar, there were two long lines of priests, each with a gold or silver bowl. As the lamb's throat was slit, the blood was caught in one of the bowls and passed down the line until the priest at the end of the line dashed it upon the altar. Can you imagine the long lines of worshipers with lambs in their hand? And the priest would grab it and cut the lamb's throat and make sure the blood goes into a basin. And they would pass the basin down the line until they get to the priest. Can you imagine how bloody they looked? Their robes were covered in blood. As they were passing this blood down one priest to the next till they finally got it to the altar. And he would dash it upon the altar. Then they would take the carcass and they would flay it, they would cut it in half, and the intestines and the fat was extracted because they were part of the sacrifice. And then the carcass was handed back to the worshiper. Brothers and sisters, there were more than 250,000 lambs slain according to his story. That is a lot of lambs. A lot of blood. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? It took all of this for families, individuals to have their sins passed over. It didn't eradicate sin. The Bible says the memory was still there. Each year, they had to do this. All of the lambs, all of the sacrifices on that day it was just blood everywhere. I can even begin to imagine 250,000 lambs being slain. The scene in the temple courts was where his blood-stained condition of the altar was hot. You couldn't even imagine how much blood was there. Once the lamb has been slaughtered and his intestines and his fat extracted, then the lamb was to be carried home for a roasting. So you could now remember, this is Peter and John doing this. Once they make sure there is no leaven in the upper room, they leave to go to the temple, and there they get the lamb ready for their sacrifice. The lamb throat is cut, the blood is sprinkled upon the altar, and the fat and the intestines are extracted. And now they take the lamb and carry it back to the upper room. It is to be roasted, not boiled. It has to be roasted. Nothing must touch it, not even the sides of a pot. It had to be roasted over an open fire, and a split was made of pomegranate wood. I think the splint is that piece of wood that went straight through his mouth and through his vent, out of the back part of him. And he was cut open. And the lamb had to be roasted with his head, legs, tail, everything still attached to it. While Jesus is in Bethany, all this is being done. The next thing the disciples had to do, it's amazing because it just says, and they had to go, they made 5 words, got everything ready for the Passover, which meant they were working the whole day. Third thing, the table has to be set. The table itself was shaped like a square with one side open. Certain things were necessary. And these were the things the disciples would have to get ready. But they had to make ready the Passover. The roasted lamb was set there to remind them of how their houses had been protected by the badge of blood when the angel of death passed over them. The reason to have the lamb is because, if you remember what happened on that night that Moses delivered the children of Israel, they put blood on the doorposts. And so that's why that was the purpose of the lamb, that the death angel passed over. Then there was unleavened bread on the table to remind them of the bread they had eaten in haste when they escaped from slavery. So the lamb is being roasted over an open flame. They're putting unleavened bread on the table. And I remember that it was said to me when I actually saw it, that the bread, that the napkin was folded in 3 parts, and the bread was placed in the center, which represents Jesus, the Father, the Son, which is the bread, and the Holy Spirit. Everything was a picture of who he is. So it was unleavened bread to remind them that they had to get out of Egypt, and then could not take the time to put leaven in bread. Could not wait for it to rise. They had to get out in a hurry. The next thing they had to place on the table was a bowl of salt water that had been placed on the table. The salt water reminded them of the tears they had shed in Egypt and of the water of the Red Sea through which they had miraculously passed through. Everything on the table is reminding them of something. They're doing it in remembrance. God established that for them never to forget their time of deliverance. How he brought them out of Egypt, which was their bondage. It was to remind them of the many tears they shed. 400 years in slavery. Isn't it amazing that when they got to the Red Sea and they thought they were hemmed in, they were ready to get them a delegation to turn themselves in? Isn't it ironic that when they got to the promised land and saw the giants there, they got mad with Moses. They cried all night. I can see those crocodile tears coming all night. And that morning they get up ready to get a delegation, a return to Egypt delegation. They forgot about all the tears. Every morning they woke up in Egypt, they were slaves. They could not do what they wanted to do. They had to do what their master told them to do. They were forced to make bread. It's amazing how soon they forgot it. And the reason why they are at the table this year is to remind them of the tears they shed when they cried out to God. And the opening of the Red Sea. So there to be a bowl of salt water on the table. Thirdly, there was a collection of bitter herbs, horseradish, cherry curry, whatever. I don't know what these are. Chicory, endive, lettuce, horehound. I don't know what that is. I make sure I look it up. I didn't have time to look it up. To remind them of the bitterness of slavery. This was bitter. Finally, there was a paste called karoshik. It was a mixture of apples, dates, pomegranate, and nuts to remind them of the clay of which they had made bricks in Egypt. Though it was their sticks of cinnamon to remind them of the straw with which the bricks had to be made. Everything on that table was to remind them of what happened in Egypt. Finally, there were 4 cups of wine, and that's significant because when we go to the Passover, there's one time in Luke that some folk try to say, oh, Judas was at the Passover, because they're eating and drinking wine, and some people equate that to Judas getting the Last Supper. No, there were more than 1 cup. There were 4 cups, and we're going to get into, starting next week, we're going to get into what happened on the Passover. We're going to try to go from point to point. There were 4 cups which were drunk in different stages of the meal, were to remind them of the 4 promises in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 to 7. When the disciples went to get things ready, this is what they had to do. All these preparations had to be made before Jesus and the other disciples arrived for the Passover. Peter and John never returned back to Bethany. When they left that morning, they were busy all day getting things prepared for the Passover. Every detail of the Passover spoke of the great day of deliverance when God liberated his people from their bondage in Egypt. We do the same thing, because it is during the Passover that Jesus instituted what we call the Lord's Supper. And what do we say? Why did he tell us to do this? We do this what? In remembrance. It is something that God wants his people never to forget. And brothers and sisters, the problem we have is that we forget so easy.
Just like the children of Israel.
Just like the children of Israel. God has done so much for us. And the minute we are faced with some type of obstacle or some type of problem, we forget everything he's done in the past. And yet he's saying, how is it that you're so easy to forget? So, when we, on first Sunday, eat of the bread and the fruit of the vine, we do this in remembrance of what Jesus has done for us. On that cross, he shed his blood. He said, I am the bread of life. And we eat and drink. We do this in remembrance of him till he comes again. This is to be done. You know, people, it says often. Everybody has a way, what they call often. There are some people do it every week. There are some people may do it every day. But we believe often is once a month. And there's some people don't do it once a month. There's some people do it once a year. But it says often you do this in remembrance of me. Finally, we're going to get to Thursday evening. Any questions?